Welcome. Thank you for joining our panel on shaping the integrated energy future. And welcome to our panelists. To speak to the technologies, policies, market, and private sector moves that will now be needed to reach net zero goals, we have this afternoon Ignacio Galán, Chairman and CEO of Iberdrola, Mads Nipper, Chief Executive of Ørsted, Elizabeth Gaines, Chief Executive of Fortescue Metals, and Andy Brown. Oh, sorry, I already said, I'm so sorry, I've mixed up the order here, and Andy Brown, Chief Executive of Galp. I'm so sorry, is there a problem with this mic? I'm sorry, I apologize, it's sort of throwing me off. I'd like to help frame our discussion, which is happening at a very interesting moment of disruption in energy markets, with a quote from Fatih Birol, head of the IEA. He wrote recently, "A key question is what today's energy crisis means for fossil fuel investments if we are still to achieve our collective climate goals. Are today's sky-high fossil fuel prices a signal to invest in additional supply or a further reason to invest in alternatives?" Mr. Brown, you said something similar in a note to the panelists when we were getting ready for this panel. How do you think this crisis is an opportunity potentially in the longer term, and what are the shorter term risks that you see?
So on the longer term, I think it is a big opportunity. I think if you look at Repower Europe, or you look at all the ambitions, ratcheting up the ambitions, so I think there's a big opportunity, but I think there are headwinds at the moment. There are headwinds on increased cost of financing, limited ability to permit new capacity, almost no capacity to make electrolyzers in Europe. So there's a lot of things to overcome. On the short term, there's some very negative things happening. Gas is being backed out clearly from Europe, gas is being backed out from China, and ultimately means more coal. So the short term, we'll see CO2 emissions rise. But longer term, this has to be an incentive to accelerate renewables. I am concerned that renewable costs, or the cost of electricity, is linked to gas. And I do consider how we can reduce that to make renewables more accessible to customers, but also unlock things like hydrogen, because hydrogen cannot exist, green hydrogen cannot exist on very expensive electricity driven up because of gas. So I think there's a balance of some really good news, but I think some concerning headwinds, and particularly the supply chain, the cost of renewables, solar and wind has gone up 20% or so. So I think, we really as a world need to tackle in a much more holistic way those supply chains in order to drive that transition.
I'd like to build on that, Ignacio, and ask you, what do you think of the proposed EU plan to speed its transition away from fossil fuels, which addresses some of the issues I think that are playing out right now, or attempts to wean off Russian fuel by 2027? Is it achievable to call for 45% of energy coming from renewables by 2030? What kind of next steps would be needed?
So I think perhaps I will send the first message. I think United States 20 years ago, 25 years ago, decided not to be any longer dependent, to have external dependency for energy. And they make the necessary resources for investing in not only in renewable, they did, but as well in shale oil, shale gas, etc., etc. And now the Americans are sufficient. In Europe, we have already a very good tool, so which I think Europe has already moved in the opposite direction. We decide to make the Fit for 55, which is decarbonizing Europe, with the intensive use of renewables. But now I think this Fit for 55 can, because of this new document has already recently published, Repower of Europe. I call this document Fit for Self-Sufficiency. I think if we, this document, the Fit for Self-Sufficiency, instead we may now, had already been made 20 years ago, in this moment the problem will be much less than they are at present. It's achievable. I think it's achievable. What is needed? First of all, I think is something which I've been 10 years talking about, permitting process, which I think nobody cares about that one, but I think it takes 5 years or 6 years, in our case, for offshore even longer, 7 years or whatever, for obtaining the permits, and it takes 1 year, 1.5 years to build, in the solar even less than that one. And now it's already, the European Commission is trying to promote those one, Americans is trying to make that one, but I think we have to move from nice word to fact in a hurry. The second and the third thing is that require huge amount of money. And I think the huge amount of it will flow to the sector if we have stability, predictability, rule of law. I think if we are in a situation in which technology, because of this particular situation, renewables are penalized, because they have to be subsidized in another sources, fossil, as is the case up to date. So still, a major part of subsidies is coming to fossil fuels. So what is the incentive for already attracting capital to invest on that one? So I think it's achievable. We have to move in a hurry. We have to change the process of permitting, and we have already to have a stable, predictable, and rule of law for guarantee the investment that we have to put. I think our investment is standing for 50, 60 years. So I just coming from a panel in which was already the Vice President of the European Commission, Timmermans, and he was saying that the timing of the business is different from the timing of the politician. So I absolutely agree. I think we have to take decisions which are already much ahead of our line, the company. But they would like to take decisions for the short term. And I think for decarbonization, we need to take decisions in the very, very long term, which is the only way to make that happen. So it's possible, but we have to change a lot of things in a hurry.
And you're suggesting that the private sector has to take a lead in pushing?
Well, I think whatever sector, I think it's not a question if it's the public sector, the public sector, the private sector, is the oil companies, the electricity companies, all. We need everybody. It's room for everybody. All is needed if we would like to decarbonize. It's not a question one against another. It's a question of one beside another. So all together to try to do all the necessary for making that happen. But each, they have to take a responsibility. It's certain. The problem of the bottlenecks of the permit is a reality in most countries what we have present.
Let's come back to that. I'd like...
I just want to pick up on this issue with subsidies for fossil fuels, because in some countries in the world it's true. In Europe it's not true. You know, half of the price of the fuel you fill in your tank in Europe is tax. And that's, you know, the CO2 tax in a refinery is very high. The tax in the upstream is high. So it is not subsidized. I think, you know, this is kind of a myth. There are countries where people are very poor, where the government thinks it's right. And I think that's right. You should not do that. I agree with that. But in a European context, a lot of tax revenues are coming from oil and gas. One of the biggest problems we faced before the war was that supply of oil and gas was not meeting demand. And the price went high. And so we've got to avoid the stick on oil and gas and put the carrot into the incentives for the new energy system. That's where we've got to focus our attention.
I'd like to come back to many of these issues, but I want to also hear from Elizabeth on the role of the private sector. You are, in some ways, both having to decarbonize your mining business and playing a role in renewables with green hydrogen. How are you going to decarbonize as a major producer, the world's biggest producer of iron ore? How do you stop it?
Well, look, firstly, business is getting on with it. There is no doubt about that. We've just had a change of government in Australia for the very reason that the population was saying we wanted a government that was more ambitious on climate policies. So, but business is taking the lead. From our perspective, I guess there's two elements to it. One is, as a mining company, we have to look at ways to decarbonise, and we've got very ambitious decarbonisation objectives, so for Scope 1 and 2, and also for Scope 3. So we're investing in technology. Critically important is the emerging technologies. We're investing in manufacturing capability. We're currently building an electrolyser facility in Gladstone in Queensland because we know that there's a global shortage of electrolysers. So we're investing in manufacturing, we're investing in energy generation, and we're investing in energy distribution. So right across the chain. And this is because it's just the smart thing to do. It's not about ticking a box from an ESG perspective because we're a mining company and we're a big emitter and our Scope 3 emissions are very significant through the Chinese steelmaking industry. It's because if we model a scenario with even today's oil price or $150 a barrel or $200 a barrel, we will find ourselves in a very different position over this decade. So we're actually taking a lead on this, and we're transitioning from being a resources company and one that is actually finding solutions to those hard-to-abate sectors. And we're also investing in or transitioning to a renewable energy company. And green hydrogen, from our perspective, is the purest form of renewable energy, and that's where we're focusing. And maybe just, if I may, just maybe to give that some context, if we think about the shipping industry and we ship our iron ore to China, if shipping were a country, it'd be the 8th largest emitter in the world. So to tackle emissions and to tackle these issues, we have to find solutions to some of these harder to abate sectors. And there is technology that exists, and that's why we're so focused on this transition.
Mads, Ørsted has made a transition. It's a company that is an example of this transition. Investors rewarded that. Now they are flocking back to oil and gas. What does that say about the direction of capital and whether will clean energy producers have a harder time attracting capital and building out the infrastructure of the future? Will oil and gas begin to compete again for capital?
No. I'm relatively convinced that the capital will keep flowing to the green sector. And I'll come back to why it's not sort of a given. But I think also back to the very first question you asked, Andy, is that it is, given the situation with the tragic war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and shortage we have right now, it is not wrong to keep some of the emitting assets running. But it would be a deadly sin to invest long-term for new capacity. Because not only is that fundamentally wrong from a climate perspective point of view, because then our 1.5 degree or even 2 degree scenario is stone dead. But the other thing is, and that this is a point that Fatih Birol also made, to saying from a pure business point of view, it's insane. Because the time when these assets become operational, they're going to be stranded assets, so no sane investor is going to make significant investments into that. So I'm not very concerned about the long-term structural shift back to fossil fuel assets. I think building on, again, what was said by my colleagues here, but it's also given that we are facing, it's a paradox because we never had higher ambitions. Just last week, building on the Repower EU and the 30 by 30 on offshore in the US and so on, 4 North Sea countries announced an ambition of 150 gigawatts to make North Sea the power plant of Europe. And it's fantastic. It's a great starting point, but it's only a starting point. And that is where just as Ignacio said, the permitting processes need to come down. We need to have the entire regulatory regime that they live from bureaucracy. That needs to be broken down with a hard hand. And then we need to make land and seabed available at scale and at affordable cost, because otherwise, if we go from, the problem is right now, we went from having subsidies of renewable power, and now we have substantial negative subsidies, whether that's in concession payments or whether that is in very high seabed costs. And what that does is that it pushes returns on renewable projects down. That is hit by inflation and, by the way, also increasing interest rates. So what do we as developers do? Several of us as developers, we push that further down. And guess what? The wind turbine makers, not one of the Western wind turbine makers make any money. So who's going to invest in the capacity? So it's a structural challenge, and we haven't even talked about grids yet. We may do that later. But it's a structural challenge where none of us can solve it alone, but regulators need to say, let's not maximize short-term tax revenue. We don't want to go back to subsidies. Let's not maximize short-term revenue, and then let us ensure that we dramatically shorten the permitting. Then we will get there, and then the capital will continue to flow, and we as developers are ready to accelerate significantly further. And if that happens, I'm not concerned about capital.
Good answer.
You asked the question about will investment flow back to oil and gas. I don't think there's any chance of that. Because, our company is investing half in renewables and half in oil and gas. We're not going to change that. We're clearly not going to change that. And the Shells and the BPs and everyone else will be the same. Private equity can't raise the capital for oil and gas. Finance, banks won't lend money to oil and gas. The problem is going to be, is there going to be enough supply to meet the demand? Will the people who have the cars, who want to fly in planes? And will that not drive high oil price for a rather long time? Which is not good for consumers. But I don't think there's a threat that somehow people will decide it'd be great now to invest back in oil and gas. Because as you say, investing in a project with a 20-year outlook is kind of foolish, because who knows what, let's hope the energy system will be predominantly renewable in 20 years' time. But, I think this is going to be a big, difficult equation to solve for the world.
So just one point on that one. I think is in the point here you're mentioning, I think it's important. I think traditionally energy product, which I think oil and gas and electricity, has been already a huge cash cow for taxation. So I agree with you that the problem in the case of Europe, we compare with the United States, we have present in 23 states in the United States. I think that the consumers are paying 10–15% taxes. In Europe is paying 60% taxes in electricity. I don't know in oil and gas, but I think the point is to clarify the point and to use already to apply a principle has been defined by the European Commission. The principle who polluters pay. To have clear, to put already a price of those things, or those which, whatever it should be, but I think with clear rules. I think I'm not opposed to pay taxes of something which is already producing afterwards certain consequences than whatever. Today I'm just influenced by the comments of Mr. by President Timmermans. So I'm not opposed to pay, but I think with clarification. But it cannot be to change the rule just because the short term is needed, some more whatever thing. And doesn't matter if it's gas, oil, electricity, onshore, offshore, whatever. So in some cases, in some countries, we are paying taxes for things which are emission-free just because it has been built 7 years ago. What was that? In other cases, we are already receiving subsidies just because we are making just now. So please, I think my point of certainty and transparency and clarity on this regulation is crucial for accelerating the process. And I think to try to uniformize as much as we can. If we apply a principle has been defined by the European Commission, which using the ETS, European trading system, it works. I think we've been able to reduce the emission by 35% in Europe since it has been installed, and we have already increased reduce the prices and reduce all those things by almost 40%, so which I think that works. And I think the system of stability of this CO2 has been defined by the European Commission as well. So, and as I used to say, the CO2 is not coming from Saudi Arabia. It's not an input which is imported somewhere else. It's a tax, but it's a tax properly applied. It's not a tax which is applied to, with a certain thing. So, in each of us, we take the decision. We have already a few power plants of gas, so which I think, and I have to take the decision, we produce with gas, or we produce with offshore, or we produce with whatever technologies which is not or solar. But with clear rules. Same thing with the industries. Industries, they would like to decarbonize, and they are every time, I have to tell you, more and more industries which is knocking out our door, please help to us to decarbonize my industrial processes. But they would like to know, not a part of their social commitment, with there are many with a social commitment as well, they would like to know what are the economic rules on that one. And that is what have to be clear, transparent, clear to take our decisions.
So if we're talking about policy, how far would a fully functioning carbon market go toward addressing some of the issues that you're talking about, and how close are we to getting that, do you think? Do any of you think?
There are CO2 prices that trigger different things to happen. And things like CCS, carbon capture and storage, above $100 kind of dollars or euros a ton, it starts to get really in the money. And it will then accelerate something that is actually not just something that you need to do because you have a conscience. It's something you do because it has a decent return. And that will crowd in a lot of finance into what will be an important part of the equation. So there are kind of triggers on CO2 tax. But carbon leakage is a big issue for Europe. Yeah. So you can drive the CO2 tax, but if it's only Europe doing it, then you have a problem for the industries of Europe.
So perhaps we should dive into some of the solutions, such as carbon capture, that many people have suggested, would be part of the equation. What are some of the technologies and components of an energy system that would add up to actually being able to meet net zero emissions goals? Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. And we should realize we have the majority of the technologies we need, but we still need some. There are many people who are sort of counting on a hockey stick that everything is going to come. The only thing we are going to achieve with that is delaying investments too long. So I think not finding excuses to move is of paramount importance. Does that mean we have everything? Absolutely not. But I would claim that the world has a greater challenge to scale technologies than to invent technologies. And just, I mean, the examples of electrolyzers were made. I mean, there's an embarrassing amount of megawatts in terms of electrolyzer capacity today, and yet we all know that green hydrogen-based fuels is going to be the key to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, which Fortescue is a prime example of. We are heavily engaged also in the maritime sector. So I think CCS, CCUS, because we need to use that, especially that CO2, especially biogenic CO2 to make fuels. That will become economic. We need that. Obviously, storage. Because to get a well-functioning base load, essentially you could say, because unfortunately we are not going to invent a global meteorological system where the sun always shines or the wind always blows. So we do need a base load which can be hydrogen-based, it can be large-scale battery-based, or it can also be sort of long-term.
Pumping storage.
Pumping storage, exactly.
I think is the only one which is economically available today.
Exactly.
And I think we have plenty, in the case of Europe, plenty of hydroelectric power plants which can be transformed in reversible.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think which much more efficient than another one. Saying that batteries, they have to play the role. Hydrogen has to play the role, many things. But the largest is one, and they are not already a clear policy how to transform our existing hydroelectric resources in pumping storage. With the exception in Switzerland, by the way. Switzerland is doing very well.
And I fully agree, and I think will something like smaller scale nuclear reactors or fusion reactors also play a role? Probably, but let's not bet the farm on it. Let's not bet the farm that it will come. Let's ensure we leverage and scale the technologies we already have at hand.
Let's come back to both nuclear and carbon capture, but I want to ask Elizabeth a little bit about green hydrogen. Fortescue recently announced a deal to produce for the European market. I just wondered about the timing. Does that show that the current crisis is promoting investment in some of the technologies that will ultimately help to speed the transition?
Well, we've certainly seen that the current global situation is accelerating those inbound inquiries about the supply of green hydrogen. We had already set a goal to produce 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030, but the crisis in Europe, we've actually seen that already. We've signed an MOU with E.ON, one of Europe's largest energy companies, for 5 million tonnes. So that's a third. In fact, they were interested in all of it, 15 million tonnes, but clearly we weren't going to necessarily commit just to one customer. So we are certainly seeing that acceleration of inquiries that then fuels that investment. And I think the point's been made on this panel is we're ready to invest. It's the approvals, the permitting, the government support, and business, as I said earlier, is getting on with it. Now we need actually the regulations to follow. Just last week, we launched the Green Hydrogen Standard at the first ever Green Hydrogen Assembly in Barcelona. So it's that accreditation, it's what is green hydrogen. I think we've got the building blocks there. We're seeing the demand. We're certainly seeing demand coming from Europe, that acceleration of demand. We're ready to invest. It does take significant capital. We think that capital is there and it's available. However, we need to have the permitting and approvals processes in place as well.
I think you mentioned Barcelona, by the way. You know, the Barcelona buses are powered by hydrogen. We produce green hydrogen already. And I think we have a few power plants of green hydrogen in this moment in operation. And the problem, apart of these things you mentioned, the big problem we are facing is large-scale electrolyzers. Yeah. So today, the largest electrolyzer is only 20 megawatts. Yes. I think that is the largest of the largest. So I think we need electrolyzers of hundreds of megawatts each. So because it's not efficient. So I think we are already just convinced an American company, which is Cummins, to come already to make a big investment in Spain, just precisely for making this sort of big size electrolyzer, because those ones are 10, 5, 7 megawatts. I think that's peanuts for what we need. Yeah. I think we need a larger scale one.
Well, we're building the biggest electrolyzer manufacturing facility in the world in Gladstone in Queensland.
Yeah. I think that's the kind of thing that the world will need. I mean, let's say Europe, it's pitiful. They say 10 times increase by 2025 to 17 gigawatts. I know, 17 gigawatts. They want to get to 200 gigawatts equivalent hydrogen by 2030, 20 million tons. If you're Fortescue, you'll need to put 150 gigawatts of renewable energy in. That's $100 billion of investment. So, you're going to need a lot of financing for that. And so these are big plans, and I think the world needs big plans like that.
And where's that financing going to come from, 100 billion? Is that a mix of different, where is that money going to come from?
Well, we're also basing those economics on current technologies. So we're obviously investing in technologies. And the initial projects might have a different economics than the later projects. And we've seen that even in our iron ore business. When we started, our cost of production was $50 a tonne. As we added scale, we've got down to $15 a tonne. So scale, reinvestment, but it does need significant financing. And it'll be a combination. There'll be specific project financing. We will partner with others. We're seeing strong demand. Offtake will play a part. So we have to stitch all that together, and that's the challenge and the opportunity. But we're confident we can do that.
And I think in order to build scale for hydrogen and for hydrogen-based fuels, it would be wise, even though I'm convinced that the really large-scale projects, especially where the green electrons are really cheap, it will be competitive and it will be relatively fast, but it would be very wise to have some kind of a demand-side stimulation that would bridge some of that cost gap. Because many people are saying, oh, no, we shouldn't have the cost for that. But if you look at like a country like my home country in Denmark, several 2 decades ago, there was a lot of support to cost bridge offshore wind and wind energy in general. That investment has paid itself back in societal value many times, because it's an investment in building a capability, building industry, building scale. And that is why, I mean, few people are going to pay sort of 3 times the price of grey hydrogen for green hydrogen now, which is what it costs somewhere. But if you could bring that premium down to maybe, say, 20% now, you will get scale, and you'll get it fast, and sooner than we know it, we can phase out those demand signals quickly.
And I think this point of reducing cost, something which is crucial, is to have already a very strong and reliable grid. I think the most efficient manner to produce hydrogen is just in-house of the user. So as closer as possible as those one which is the final user. So the hydrogen has very low density, energetic density. If you need to transport that one, that is very costly. So I think there are some cases which I think you need to transport. I'm not opposed to that one. But very many things, I think, for train, I was talking here is one of my colleagues and I think you need already trucks, etc., etc. The easiest thing, same with chargers. Everybody talk about the chargers for electric vehicles. Chargers without a strong and reliable grid doesn't work. So if you would like to use hydrogen for refueling your truck, or you would like to have electric truck, so I think you need to have power. And I think power with very reliable grid. Yeah. And I think nobody talks about that one today. I think Fatih Birol mentioned. I think I'm very pleased that finally somebody is already listening to me. So, but grid is crucial. So a very strong and reliable grid is crucial for decarbonizing. Not only for transporting the electricity generated by renewable, but as well for final consumer uses, which to have as close as possible the charges just in place, to have already the hydrogen for those who would like to the hydrogen. So, because, well, I think it's needed. And in many cases, regulation is not still aware that we need to already increase heavily this one. Now we are talking about transmission. And when they talk about transmission, they talk about transmission, interconnection in gas, which I agree. But that is cheaper to interconnection with electricity. So it's faster and quicker.
Let's talk about consumers for a minute. They've come up a few times. We, consumers, have come up a few times. And the connection, perhaps, to regulatory issues and barriers and bottlenecks. To what degree, when you encounter permitting issues or delays, do you think policymakers or regulators are responding to public issues? I know there have been issues around, wind farms off the east coast of the US, in Europe as well. How does the consumer get it? Is the consumer part of the issue with the permitting?
No. No, I was just going to say, I think our current energy system has a footprint, and that footprint is damaging our climate. The new energy system will have a footprint. It won't be a zero footprint. And I think somehow we have to create an environment where public's concerns are taken into account. But I think this thing in the Repower Europe about overriding interest, which basically means we're going to build it anyway, although the community may not want it on their back door. We're going to have to do that. If we don't do that, we won't get the renewable build-out that we need. And we won't have the lithium mines, for instance, in Europe that might need for a battery value chain. And so those are the kind of things that I think we're just really going to have to address as a society. And the politicians somehow need to be able to stand up to local pressure in order to achieve what needs to be achieved. And it may be high voltage power lines, it may be renewables, it may be lithium mines.
I think consumers is too simplified, but it's more all stakeholders. Because I actually think consumers may actually be the least issue we have. But I think this morning, Ignacio and I had a meeting where our colleague Anna from Vattenfall introduced a new thing. Is the world is going from NIMBY, so not in my backyard, to banana, which is built absolutely nothing near anyone anywhere. So it's and that is where whether it's coastal communities that don't want the view, whether it's nobody wanting to have a landfall, whether it is biodiversity concerns, we should take them very seriously. But if we go fishermen, commercial fishing, whatever have you, and I'm speaking primarily for offshore, which is our main business, the totality of those stakeholder concerns. And I'll give an example of saying, it doesn't matter where it is, but we permitted, we spent years permitting an offshore wind site. And honestly, we are spending, we ended up paying sort of, I think, 20 million pounds for building artificial nesting structure in a £3 billion pound infrastructure project. I don't mind 20 million pounds, but I sure as heck mind 3 years of delay because it took so long to find out how to deal with those things. So I think back to permitting, and this we really support this overriding societal concern. We're saying yes, there are compromises to be made, but let us not signal as an industry to the rest of the world we don't care about your concerns, because then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Biodiversity, commercial fishermen, local communities, we need to take it seriously, but let us be much more efficient and predictable in dealing with it.
Elizabeth, I think you had, I'm sorry, I think Elizabeth.
Sorry, I was just going to add as well, I think, green energy can fundamentally change the geopolitical landscape as well. Because we'll by installing renewable energy, that takes away the power where one nation can actually control fossil fuels. So I think communities' acceptance of investment in renewable energy will shift and is shifting currently.
But we have to be careful we don't actually rely on another country for all of our renewable energy kind of components.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. On that point, perhaps we could turn to the audience and see whether anyone has any questions for the panel. Yes, we have one in the front. Yes.
Hello, I'm from Reuters News. Two quick questions. One is more of a short-term question. The panelists discussed here the ideas of green energy and how sort of fossil fuel hasn't got a chance to really win the long-term race. But what's your sort of assessment when we meet here, say, in January for the next forum, and there's a 5% loss of oil supply, a 30% loss of gas supply for Europe? How is, in the short term, how is the supply situation is going to look like for the continent in the next few months? And a slightly longer-term question, which Andy has just touched on, a lot of industries, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're speaking about hydrogen, wind power, batteries. A lot of this stuff comes from China. I mean, and in a much greater scale that it comes from Russia, essentially. So how does this feel to moving from one very dangerous dependency into another very dangerous dependency? Thank you.
I think, long term, already today, the cost of renewable power, if we talk about power, is lower than any fossil fuel sources or nuclear for that matter. So I think it is already competitive. So what we're talking about is what stands in the way of us continuing to expand. I think the situation next January, I would not be gravely concerned about that. We are still going to have an energy shortage, and from a climate point of view, it's deeply saddening that we're probably going to emit more through coal and lignite and whatever we can do. But I think what we are also underestimating the potential of energy efficiency. Again, the example of saying how many billions of cubic meters of gas we can save if we all lowered our temperature in our houses by 2 degrees over the winter. So if we hit on all cylinders, so to speak, in terms of efficiency, winding down LNG imports, strategically keeping some of the more emitting fuels. I am convinced we will manage through, even though there is even less rushing in oil and gas. But it would not be easy. It will not be easy, but it's doable.
Can I just? I'm not as optimistic.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't think, will consumers live 2 degrees cooler in their homes this winter? I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not that confident. If you look at forward prices on the market, they're not going down much for next January. Europe's going to take years to wean itself off Russian gas. There isn't the LNG capacity to make up the difference. Efficiency may be the biggest lever there. The oil markets will have to see on how much capacity Russia loses. And products, diesel and gasoline products, are very low, historically at very, very low levels. So the energy system is in absolute distress at the moment. But as I discussed before, there isn't the capital going towards that. The rig rates in America aren't building up as fast as you would have seen a few years ago, because people are now nervous about investing in oil and gas. So we're not getting the supply response we would normally get. And that is a problem. And if you start putting windfall taxes on all sorts of things, that will just become the new price. And that is not going to be good for the consumer.
So nevertheless, I would like to be optimistic, not so pessimistic. I think at least in Europe, we suddenly been analyzing what is the spare resources we have already in Europe. I think up to now, each country was making the plan for their own. It was not already enough share, which is the capabilities. Now is a much deep analysis, what is the capacities of regasification, what is the capacities of interconnection. And I think many things can be done in a hurry without passing through all this process of permitting. But I think to make already a transmission line take months, to make already pipe take months. But I think if we have to pass these 5 years of analysis, it will be impossible. But we're in a hurry. I think we have to apply the national interest of for all those things. So it's. But I think Europe is already taking seriously to making the analysis, what is our capabilities, and we are discovering we have more capabilities than those we were already expecting for helping each another in this one.
I think we have a question in the front.
Yes, hello. I'm Marco Alvará. I was until last week the CEO of SNAM. Now I stepped down to start my own company, working with colleagues to build a big hydrogen project. And we heard from Elizabeth, I truly agree that to vertically integrate into the electrolyzer and like Enel is doing into the solar manufacturing because of the inflation we're seeing, and you mentioned the low margins in the wind turbines. The old round of subsidies in solar 15 years ago resulted in $1 trillion of subsidies going to build 12 factories in China. It took 15 years and solar came from 800 to 10. Now we should do it the other way around and start with manufacturing. You mentioned, Mr. Galan, Cummins. Do you see the utilities in Europe being able to get together like Airbus, like pooling together the competences to build this manufacturing capacity so that we preserve the industry, but also we avoid having a boom and bust cycle of unpredictable manufacturing?
I'll be delighted if that happens. But
Yes.
I think meantime, if that happens, the important thing is to have already these electrolyzers available. And I think if Airbus is the consequence of several factories of different countries for making their own planes, then finally they already make one, they unify. But I think now the important is to have electrolyzers. I'll be delighted that happens. But meantime, please, we have to try to have already the supply chain have to be there for already helping to us to make already this hydrogen.
And maybe bridging to the second question that Dimitri had before, because I think they marry quite well. Let's not forget about the wind turbines. Because as I mentioned before, all the major Western wind turbine manufacturers are loss-making. Yeah. And that's a strategic challenge. It's not just a supply chain capacity challenge to ramp up, it's a strategic challenge. Because who would be ready to step in and supply much lower cost state-supported turbines? China. And is that what we want to do? Learning from both from geopolitical concerns, but certainly also from what has happened in other industries with solar, also with human rights issues and everything. So I'm not sure that I respect when it's done, the backward integration of actually investing production capacity of critical technologies, but I think we can step up as an industry, both company by company, but also if we unify as an industry, say we are prepared to commit off-taker volumes. That's what we did recently, and even though we are mainly offshore, we stepped up and gave a significant commitment to a pure US-based solar panel supplier because we could see it was going nowhere with China.
I wonder what you think about small modular nuclear reactor technology. I mean, is that off the table?
So I think we own 6 or 7 nuclear power plants. I think the decision is not a decision we can take, we as business leaders. It's a political decision. So the political decision, the countries have already decided to go ahead with nuclear, with new nuclear, or to extend the life of the existing one. The country has already decided to close the one in a certain date, but it's not something which is dependent on ourselves. I think technology can exist or cannot exist, but I think that the decision is not to be based in technology, will not be based in economic reason, will be based in political reason. So there are countries we decide simply, well, I think, Germany has already decided to close. We in Spain, they have already, we agree as well to close from 28 to 35, and that's it. So I think this nuclear can already work for longer if they go live, but I think that the political decision is taken is nothing to see with that one. So to build new ones is dependent on a political decision.
But as I understand your question, it's a smaller scale. Let me put it this way, as a world citizen, I hope and pray that we will, because I think we need to as many levers as possible. Am I convinced about whether that will happen and in what time frame? No, but I believe there are promising technologies out there. And should somebody invest to ensure we give it a real shot? Absolutely. But I think it's, as I mentioned before, the worst thing we can do is to bet that some miraculous new technology is going to fly in and save us.
But do you think it will have the same political backlash?
No.
Even at a smaller modular?
I think, I'm not an expert, but I think many of the biggest concerns we have, both about the cost but also about the waste, if some of those technologies live up to the early promises, that won't be the same political concern.
It's dependent on the public opinion, and the public opinion in some countries is such in one direction, they don't understand if it's big or small or medium. So.
But can the goals be met without nuclear? I mean, can net zero be achieved? Can the emissions and climate targets be achieved without nuclear playing a bigger role? I guess is a question that hangs over the whole conversation.
It could be, but it may be more expensive.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Do we have any other questions? Last question?
I think for securing the energy future, you mentioned about efficiency, and of course there are a couple of examples. And how big is this efficiency solution? Because I feel that demand side is something that, I mean, this time when the new energy situation came up, people talked about 2 degrees reduction. But then the whole consumption side of the energy side, both the industry as well as the consumer, what is the kind of impact we can make through demand side? And is there enough being done on that?
Before I joined the energy industry a couple of years back, I worked for the world's largest water pump manufacturer, and the reason I joined that was because 10% of the world's electricity consumption is on water pumps. That can be reduced to half with existing technology. That's just an illustration of what can be done, let alone isolation of houses. We heard earlier today, I heard the previous energy minister from Ukraine saying how inefficient the installation and therefore the heating system for housing in Ukraine is. There's so much that can be done. And the good thing is it's both electrification and energy efficiency can have a very short cycle. So I never see it, we should never see it as a competition between renewable energy or new technologies or energy efficiency and electrification. It's all of it at the same time.
Cooling and heating represent almost 40% of the energy total consumption.
Exactly.
So if it's 3 times more than the transport consumption. So if we are able to reduce whatever thing in this cooling and heating, so will be already a tremendous saving. And I think today there are technologies so to transform boilers into heat pumps that help. The isolation has been mentioned already, cannot help a lot. So, but I think the technology is there, and behind we need more strong grid as well for that one, for electrifying. Sorry, I'm
last
coming
word.
again.
Oh, I was just going to say, we've installed new technology on some of our ships, our ore carriers. They're still operating on bunker fuel, but the efficiency that we're getting. So those technologies do exist. There are things that we can do to get greater efficiency, and we've seen significant advancements and reduction in emissions as a result of installing existing technology, utilising existing energy, and we've still seen those benefits.
Listening to you all, it's interesting to take away the point. I think they were your words, Mads. It's all of it. It all adds up. It's not one magic bullet or one technology or one approach. I want to thank you all for not only tackling the big transition to net zero in this panel, but also the energy crisis of the moment and really the reshaping of the geopolitics of energy and a move toward what sounds like it may be a new definition of energy security. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the World Economic Forum, and thank you to the audience.